So we're just going to wait to let everybody in. And Wendy, we still see you. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we have what promises to be an informative and provocative program for you this evening, featuring Professor Reece Jones, here to talk about his new book, Nobody is Protected: How the Border Patrol Became the Most Dangerous Police Force in the United States. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Nobody is Protected. Reece is a political geographer who studies immigration restrictions and border violence. He's a professor and the chair of the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawaii. He's also editor-in-chief of the journal Geopolitics, the author of 3 previous books, Border Walls, Violent Borders, and White Borders. As you can tell from the subtitle of his new book, which calls the Border Patrol the most dangerous police force in the US, Reece has some serious concerns about the agency. In Nobody is Protected, he tells the story of how the Border Patrol grew from a small, underfunded frontier organization established in 1924 into a modern, sophisticated paramilitary force of 19,000 agents. This expansion and transformation occurred under both Republican and Democratic administrations and was driven significantly by several Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s that affirmed the Border Patrol's authority to set up interior checkpoints, conduct warrantless stops, and use racial profiling. Reece examines these cases along with the rest of the agency's history, describing how the Border Patrol has come to operate with wide discretion, not just along the borders and not just on immigration cases. Review and Kirk has called Reece's book provocative and necessary, and Publishers Weekly described it as a troubling look at what Americans have sacrificed in the name of border security. And we're proud to be doing the first event with him on the pub date of the book. In conversation with Reece will be Austin Kocher, a legal and political geographer who's an assistant professor at Syracuse University, where he works with a research institute. His focus has been on mapping and analyzing large federal data sets related to the immigration system, as well as trends within the federal criminal and civil courts. So please join me in welcoming Reece and Austin.
All right, well, thanks for having us. And Reece, it's great to see you. It's great to see this book out. So thanks for the work that you put into the book, and I'm excited to get started in the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for hosting this today. And thanks, Austin, for joining me for this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this will be a really rich conversation. I can already see I'm recognizing some folks in the chat who I'm excited to invite to have questions during the Q&A time. I want to get started just with a few opening remarks. This is a really important book that comes, I think, at a really crucial time. I think it touches on, or it emerges in the middle of 3 important contexts, just to set this up kind of for our audience. Reece, your book looks at Border Patrol, which has jurisdiction around the borders, and we're going to talk about this in a second, and is really a warning flag, I think, for a lot of people in the country, even people who don't see themselves as immigrants, don't live near the border, or don't think of themselves as living near the border, to really wake up and pay attention to what this agency is becoming and its really extended reach. And we're going to get into that. But I think it emerges at a time that is really crucial around 3 sort of overlapping areas. One is this sense that the border has become and immigration more broadly has become such a major political backdrop to one of the most divisive issues in the country right now. And I think Border Patrol is really at the center of that, even though these agencies are not particularly well understood, as you point out in the book. Second, I think it also comes at a time when police as institutions, as law enforcement agencies, as institutions, are coming under further criticism and critique for their use of violence and for the way that they're operating internally, often in ways that are not transparent to the public and are not good, are not really actually providing safety. And I think the title of your book, Nobody is Protected, obviously gets at that, and we'll get into that. And third, I think most importantly, the book really gets at questions around race and policing and the way that race and racism are instituted in law enforcement institutions in the country. Certainly, your most recent book on white borders examines the history of race and racism in producing the immigration system that we have today. But this book takes a much closer and deeper dive into Border Patrol in particular. So I wonder if you can just start us out by talking about what Border Patrol is. There's a lot of immigration institutions out there, a lot of acronyms. So maybe you can just start us off before we get into the meat of the book by explaining, what is Border Patrol, where do they come from, and what do they do?
Yeah, thanks, Austin. Thanks for that introduction. There really is an alphabet soup of different agencies that are involved in border control in the US. So as Brad mentioned, the Border Patrol was established in 1924, so it's less than 100 years old. But before that, the US had customs officials, right? And so customs officials were at points of entry doing custom checks, document checks, that sort of thing. After the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the customs agency also started to employ mounted Chinese inspectors whose job was to ride around border towns looking for people of Chinese appearance and seeing if they had the right documents and removing them from the country if they didn't. And then after 1924, the Border Patrol was established to take over that role nationally, to enforce the immigration rules at the borderline and at the interior of the country. At that time, the Border Patrol was part of the Department of Labor. Then they were moved to the Department of Justice. Then after the Department of Homeland Security was created in 2002, Customs and Border Protection were moved together into a single agency. So within the Department of Homeland Security, there's Customs and Border Protection, which has three parts, which is the Border Patrol. They wear green uniforms. There are about 20,000 Border Patrol agents. They're in charge of everything between the points of entry. There's Office of Field Operations. They wear blue uniforms. If you've ever crossed at a point of entry or at an airport, you've encountered Office of Field Operations officers. They're the ones that check your documents there. There's a third part of Customs and Border Protection, which is air and marine operations. They wear brown uniforms. They operate all of the boats, but also the airplanes and drones that the Border Protection has. And they don't have any limit to where they can operate in the US. So they can use those drones anywhere inside of the territorial US. Additionally, in Department of Homeland Security, there's also the ICE, which I think is also a familiar acronym to a lot of people. That's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Then within that, there are two different parts. There's Homeland Security Investigations, who do things like cartels and that sort of enforcement in the US. And then there is the ERO, which is shoot, I lost what the E is in my mind, but but it's the removal group. So they're the ones that are looking for people with deportation orders and removing people inside the US. So this book, I'm mostly focused on the Customs and Border Protection and specifically the Border Patrol.
Yeah, and specifically looking at Border Patrol, we're going to get into some of the more recent historical developments, but you have a lot. One of the things I think is really strong about the book, Reece, is that you have a lot of first-person narratives around people's lives at the border. And I wonder if you could draw on that work that you did for the book to sort of paint a picture, just like today or in recent memory based on your field work. What does it look like for people who are along the border to have encounters with Border Patrol? Like, what does that interaction even look like on a mundane basis today?
Yeah, well, I think the key point, and one of the key things I focus on in the book, is that the border zone is much bigger than a lot of people realize, right? So when you just said people near the border, I think probably for most people, the thing that came to their mind was the US-Mexico border, right? People who live very close to that borderline, that must be where the Border Patrol operates. But the law for the Border Patrol says that they can operate a reasonable distance from the border inside in the interior of the US. And in 1947, that was set as within 100 miles of borders and coastlines, right? So it's an enormous zone that includes an area that has 2/3 roughly of the US population. A number of major cities are in that border zone: Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Seattle, all of those, Boston, all of those are border cities by the definition of the Border Patrol uses. A number of entire states, for example, here in Hawaii, there's nowhere that's more than 100 miles from a coastline. So the entire state is the border zone. And so the people who are listening to this right now, if they're in the US, the odds are they're in the border zone right now, right? So what we're talking about with the things that the Border Patrol can do and the exceptions that they have to the Fourth Amendment are things that don't just happen at the US-Mexico border, but can happen in a vast area inside the United States.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And you know, one of the things that you talk about a lot in the book is are the kind of exceptions and the expansive powers that CBP has. You know, I've spent time along the border. You certainly spent a lot more time there than I have. But even doing a lot of my field work was in Ohio, for instance, in the past. And Ohio has, you know, most people may not think of Ohio as a border state, but a large part of the northern part of Ohio is well within that zone. And I remember, you know, many times driving up through northern Ohio to go to the Cleveland Immigration Court. And, you know, you'll see Border Patrol trucks, the green trucks, you know, parked along the roads. And, you know, and so even, you know, big parts of Ohio, which people may not think of as a border state, certainly fall within that. You know, Border Patrol's powers have become, within this 100-mile border zone in particular that you mentioned, have become really expansive in recent decades. I wonder if you could talk about what is different if you're in that 100-mile border zone. Why does that, you know, matter? Why should people think about that as a different kind of zone of exception?
Yeah, I think an example will illustrate that. So I first started to really think about this when I was doing research for my first book about border walls. And I was in Texas, south of El Paso, and I was driving with a rancher on a public Texas highway near the border. And in a 1-hour period where we were driving to his land, looking at the wetlands along the Rio Grande, and then back to my car, we were stopped by the Border Patrol 5 times in a 1-hour period of time, pulled over by the Border Patrol on a public road. And so I was just, is this really possible? Can the Border Patrol really do this? And the answer turns out to be yes, they can. So within that 100-mile zone, they have the authority to stop vehicles without a warrant. And so this is something that came before the Supreme Court in the 1970s, and they decided that is not a violation of the Fourth Amendment, which normally protects people inside the United States from unreasonable searches and seizures. Usually, police need to have probable cause to stop someone, search their vehicle, or get permission, right, or have a warrant. But the Border Patrol has a much lower standard. They just need to be able to articulate at least 2 facts, according to the Supreme Court in 1975, about why they wanted to stop a vehicle. And the Supreme Court listed what those facts could be, one of which is driving on a border road, for example. So essentially anywhere in the border zone, they've already got 1 fact for why they can stop a vehicle. They just need a second one. The other thing that's remarkable is the facts don't have to be about particularized about the specific vehicle. Instead, they can be the general characteristics of the area, right? So this is an area known for smuggling and it's near the border. You can stop any vehicle in that way, right? So and they do, right? And so the Border Patrol has this authority to make these roving stops. The other thing that makes this border zone exceptional are the checkpoints that the Border Patrol has and operates in this border zone. We could talk more about those if you want as well.
Yeah, I would, because I think for those of us who don't encounter those checkpoints on an everyday basis, it might be a little bit hard to imagine. So maybe you could paint a picture of what these look like for people in the area. I mean, my understanding is that part of the frustration here, and part of one of the consequences, I think, one of the arguments in your book is that we all need to be worried about what's happening with Border Patrol, not just someone who's crossing the border, because it's affecting, if you live in the area, it's affecting you, like the rancher you mentioned. If you're driving back and forth to work in the region, you may have to go to these, go through these checkpoints. So what do these checkpoints look like when you're going through them? Like, what's the experience like, and how does it differ? How does your experience differ based on who you are and what you look like and where you're from?
Yeah, so as I talk about in the book, the checkpoints as well were considered by the Supreme Court in 1976 in a case called Martinez Fuerte. And at the time, so all of these key cases were in the mid 1970s. And at that time, the Border Patrol had about 1,500 agents, right? So it was a pretty small agency. And at that time, they were primarily operating very close to the US-Mexico border. What the case can, so today though, there are of course 19,000 Border Patrol agents, right? And they're operating over a much larger area. And so what that case considered was whether the Border Patrol, based on this authority to do stops without a warrant, could set up a checkpoint on a US highway up to 100 miles from the border itself, and stop every single vehicle on that highway, briefly seize those vehicles, and ask the drivers and the passengers about their immigration status. And the Supreme Court decided that yes, they could do that in these interior areas. And so in the years since then, the Border Patrol has grown to be a much larger organization. So they have the resources and the people to set up these checkpoints in a lot of places far beyond what they were doing in 1976. So what does this look like? The Border Patrol runs 113 different checkpoint locations. About 40 of those are actually on the northern border, mostly in New York State, but also in Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine. But the majority, of course, are on the southern border. Some of them are very permanent structures. They have, covered platforms, what looks like a toll booth, entire office buildings on the side where they do more detailed inspections. Most of the Border Patrol checkpoints have automated license plate readers. So as soon as your car pulls into this checkpoint, your license plate is fed into a DEA database where they keep it for 15 years in that database. A number of the checkpoints also have radiation detectors. The idea being, so after September 11th, the Border Patrol repositioned themselves as a front line against terrorism in the United States. And so the idea is that these checkpoints can locate a dirty bomb by testing for radiation. They haven't located any dirty bombs, but there have been incidents where people who have recently had radiation treatment for cancer, for example, have set off these sensors at checkpoints. In about a decade ago, at the time 96-year-old former governor of Arizona, Raul Castro, was passing through a checkpoint going from Nogales to Tucson, and his recent cancer treatment set off the radiation sensor, and they made him stand outside the car for over 30 minutes in the blazing sun while they searched his vehicle, the former governor of the state. The last thing they're doing at these checkpoints, and this is maybe the most concerning, is during that brief period of time where the vehicle stops, they use dogs to walk around the exterior of each vehicle, sniffing for drugs. And so what the data shows, there was recently a Government Accountability Office report on the checkpoints. And what that data showed was that they don't catch many immigrants at these checkpoints. They're not effective at all at that purpose, but they do make a lot of drug seizures at these interior checkpoints.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of people who are, whether they have, the laws of the United States are changing, of course. And so, lots of things are being legalized. And so even people who have things legally or illegally and are US citizens are getting, stopped, which sounds to me very much like some kind of general law enforcement activity. This doesn't sound to me like border enforcement.
Yeah, so that's something that is really questionable about these interior checkpoints. So in the 1976 Supreme Court ruling, it's very specific, right? It says they can only be used for immigration purposes. Because of course, in the 1970s, the Border Patrol wasn't doing drug enforcement and definitely wasn't doing terrorism stuff. And it says that they can't do anything beyond what's mentioned in that ruling. And then in the year 2000, there was a separate Supreme Court case, which wasn't about the border, but it's Edmond versus City of Indianapolis. And in that ruling, the Supreme Court said that police cannot do generalized checkpoints, right? That if they're going to set up a checkpoint, it needs to have a very specific purpose, right? So like an immigration checkpoint or a drunk driving checkpoint, but they can't just set up a checkpoint on a highway and stop every single vehicle and just look for general violations of the law. But nevertheless, that's what it kind of looks like is happening at these immigration checkpoints. So that GAO report had a lot of startling data about these. The first is that over the 5-year period that they covered, which was 2016 to 2020, 250 million vehicles, these are American vehicles on American roads, passed through an interior Border Patrol checkpoint, right? That's a staggering number of seizures. And every single one of those, that counts as a brief seizure of that vehicle while they do the inspection. That's a shocking number of stops at these checkpoints. But they don't turn out to make a lot of immigration arrests at these checkpoints. So the Border Patrol spends about 10% of their hours, labor work hours at these checkpoints, but they only account for 2% of their immigration enforcement apprehensions, right? So it's not working in terms of immigration enforcement. But they do get a lot of drugs there, right? And like we suggested a minute ago, those drugs tend to not be drugs that have come from across the border. Instead, these are primarily people who are already in the US, the majority of them American citizens. 91% of the people who were cited over that 5-year period at an interior checkpoint for a drug violation was an American citizen. And the majority of them, they haven't left the country. Instead, they're driving from 2 different locations within the United States and happen to have some drugs on them. Over 50% of those stops were for less than 1 ounce of marijuana, which is legal in a number of states where these checkpoints exist. These have caught up a lot of quite famous people. And in the last 15 years, musicians on their tour buses have been caught up in these interior checkpoints. Snoop Dogg, Willie Nelson, Lil Wayne, Fiona Apple, Nelly, all of them have been cited for drug violations at an interior checkpoint, but having not left the United States.
I mean, it's really remarkable. Those numbers are remarkable. The number of stops that are happening essentially in what you describe as a kind of constitution-free zone. I mean, you know, we've had a very difficult, challenging Supreme Court cycle where there's been a lot of decisions that have come down. Roe has been overturned, and I think that there's I sense anyway, a palatable sense of disillusionment about what constitutional protections are. But I think what you're getting at here is that this zone has been. It's not a recent phenomenon. That this is something. This is a space. This is a geography where essentially significant parts of the Constitution, and I think constitutional protections that many of us take for granted, really don't exist in some sort of practical, meaningful sense. One of the stories that is really
let me just add onto that one real quick, and then we can move on. I think the thing that I emphasize in this book is the growth of the Border Patrol, right? So 50 years ago, when most of these cases were being considered, the Border Patrol was really small and was mostly operating close to the US-Mexico border. But today, there are almost 20,000 agents, and definitely on the right wing in politics in the US, they'd like to see that a lot higher, right? So it suggests over the next 50 years, if we try to project forward and see what they're going to be doing, it's going to be a much bigger agency. And they have this authority to do this in this much wider area. And we see that growth already on the northern border, right? At 44 of these checkpoints are in the northern border, right? Which is places that you might not expect them to be. And so they could put these up in any of those cities that we talked about previously, right? They legally can set up a Border Patrol checkpoint on I-95 outside of Washington, D.C., and stop every single vehicle on that highway and ask people about their immigration status. They're not doing that yet, but they could, right? And so what I'm arguing in this book is that we need to rethink that authority before they do, because we're already seeing the dramatic expansion of this into places that didn't used to see interior border enforcement. And that's only going to continue unless these things are changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that you show in the book, and I was just before the call, I was looking at some of the data that we have at Track on Border Patrol apprehensions, and I'm looking at the data and seeing, I mean, the number of Border Patrol apprehensions is down from the 1990s. In fact, when you go back to the 80s and 90s, they were doing more apprehensions then than they are doing now. But you're saying, I mean, they're growing, and I just wonder if this growth, if you think this growth is justified based on any sort of metrics that we have on Border Patrol.
No. One data point that I include in the book is the number of apprehensions per agent per month. So when I was writing the book, I looked at the data from 2010 to 2019. So over that entire decade, how many apprehensions was the average Border Patrol agent making per month? And the answer is two apprehensions per month over that entire decade, right? So that's like, an entire 2 weeks on duty that they make one apprehension, right? So there are far more Border Patrol agents than are needed to do the type of work that they're doing, even if we accept the premise that we even need someone doing that sort of work, which I would question that as well. If we look at the more recent years, so the last couple of years, there've been more, right? More apprehensions by the Border Patrol. But if we add those in, it only gets up to something like 9 or 10 apprehensions per agent per month, right? So it's still one apprehension every 3 days on duty or something like that. So it's a job that, for the most part, although the border is described as this crazy, hectic, wild place, the reality is, for most Border Patrol agents, is a pretty boring job where they're sitting in a vehicle for day after day, staring at the border wall with really very little to do.
Yeah, crucial to thinking about the context of whether this growth is justified. I want to come back to some of the recent, really troubling stories that you have about Border Patrol expansion that I think we both share some concerns, not just with where they're operating, but actually the amount of data that they're collecting and the way that they're using intelligence and surveillance. But there's one story that's central to the book that we can't miss. And that is around this issue of the lack of full constitutional protections. One of the central stories to this book has to do with a case called Brignone-Ponce that comes out of the 1970s. And, as I mentioned at the outset, this book sort of comes at a time where we're thinking critically, I think, as a country about what should we do with the police? Do we need the police? What's the role of the police in reproducing racism? And I think one of the most common critiques of the police that sort of tends to come out is that the police are using racial profiling, with the assumption that, well, racial profiling is obviously bad and it's obviously illegal. Is racial profiling illegal in the country everywhere?
No. So that's the thing that I think a lot of people are not aware of when it comes to immigration policing, is that immigration police, both the Border Patrol, but also Immigration and Customs Enforcement and field operations at points of entry, are all allowed to use racial profiling in their work. This has been approved by the Supreme Court. That's what that Brignone-Ponce case was fundamentally about. In that case, this man, Felix Brignone-Ponce, was driving from San Diego to Los Angeles. He was 60 miles north of the border when he drove past a Border Patrol vehicle. This was in 1973. And when he drove by, it was at nighttime, and the headlights of their vehicle lit up the vehicle. And they thought he looked Mexican. And they thought his passengers looked Mexican. And so based only on that reason, they pulled him over and eventually arrested him for transporting people who were undocumented inside the United States. Turns out he was an American citizen. He was from Puerto Rico, right? So definitely not Mexican. And only one of the passengers was actually Mexican. The other person was from Guatemala. But the Supreme Court case was, is that allowed, right? Can the Border Patrol stop someone just because they looked Mexican? And the Supreme Court ruled in 1975 that no, they could not stop someone based only on their Mexican appearance. But they ruled that when we were talking about those articulable facts, they need to stop a vehicle, they need at least two facts. And one of those facts can be the appearance of the driver, right? The Supreme Court ruling mentioned specifically that Border Patrol agents are trained to recognize Mexican haircuts. That's the exact phrase that it says in the Supreme Court ruling. Mexican mode of dress, right? So essentially, the Border Patrol can make a stop based only on the appearance of the driver and driving near a border road. And they're allowed to do that based on the Supreme Court ruling. The 1976 case, the one about the checkpoints, said that at the checkpoints, they don't need any other factor other than race to make a stop, to make an additional inspection. So when you go through those checkpoints, your vehicle is seized briefly, they ask you about your citizenship, and in that 10 seconds while you're there, they need to decide whether they should divert you to a secondary inspection, where they do a much more thorough interrogation. And the Supreme Court said in 1976 that the Border Patrol agents can use the race of the driver as the only reason to divert someone to secondary inspection. In Arizona, a number of groups, there's a group called People Helping People that did an analysis of the checkpoint near Arivaca, Arizona. And they found that people of color were 20 times more likely to be diverted to secondary inspection than white people who passed through these checkpoints. All of this was reconsidered again by the Obama administration in 2014. So the Obama administration looked into racial profiling for federal police officers, so FBI, all of that sort of stuff. And they decided that the federal police officers could not use racial profiling in their work, right? So it's banned for most police. But there's an exception in the Obama Eric Holder's decision on racial profiling that creates an exception for immigration police. So Border Patrol and Customs don't have to abide by that. So they can still, through today, use racial profiling in their work.
I mean, it's a remarkable thing, I think, to learn that racial profiling not only is not illegal, but actually, a part of the practice of Border Patrol, especially in the context that you've described, where something like 2/3 of all people in the country live in this zone now. They're in this zone right now, and that kind of behavior is legal. The other troubling thing for me, also as a geographer, you are a border expert, so you spend a lot of time around borders. And I think that unfortunately, like, borders project this weird kind of myth that borders mark some sort of point of division. And so I just wonder, in addition to whether or not this is even valid or legitimate for, immigration policing, I mean, this part of especially along the southern border, I mean, right, just enormous historical cultural groups that have been there longer than white Caucasian Americans are living there on the US side of the border, right? And they must be getting caught up in this as well, even though they're US citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the majority of who's getting caught up in this, right? I mean, the experience of living in that border zone where they do this enforcement today is constant harassment from the Border Patrol because they can. This is what they're allowed to do. And so, yeah, it does mean frequently getting extra inspections at the checkpoints, getting pulled over for simply driving on a road, right? So it's just routine, but it shouldn't be, right? I think the other thing that's concerning about this, right, is that, and I know we're getting close to the time, we should probably take some questions from the audience, but the other thing that I talk about in the book is because the Border Patrol has so many agents and relatively little work to do at the border, we see this constant seep into more interior types of things, right? And to me, that's probably the thing that makes them the most dangerous, because they have already these carve outs to the Fourth Amendment. that give them this kind of extreme authority compared to regular police officers. They can use racial profiling in their work, and they've got a lot of time on their hands, right? And so we've seen them deployed for purposes outside of immigration enforcement. So during the summer of 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests, Border Patrol agents were deployed to dozens of cities across the US. And that was done under a different regulation in the Department of Homeland Security. It's section 40, 13, 15, I think it is. And this gave them the authority to protect federal buildings, right? But the rule says that they can do that on and off site, and that they can make arrests for any violations of law without a warrant, right? And so that's where we saw things like in Portland, for example, there were the videos of people in the middle of the night having this minivan come speeding up beside them, the door open up and people get grabbed off the street and thrown into these minivans and driven off without any explanation. So that was the Border Patrol that was doing that under these other regulations. We also see that air and marine operations, those are the drones that can operate anywhere in the United States. They're frequently used by other police agencies, kind of lent out for these other purposes. So in the days after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, Customs and Border Protection drone flew over the city, providing a visual of the situation there. Of course, that's outside the 100-mile zone and has nothing to do with immigration purposes, but nevertheless is that kind of seepage into the interior. I think a lot of your work too is on this same sort of an idea, right? Particularly in the ways that immigration policing is used to collect data on people, right? So, we already talked about the license plate readers and things like that. I know that a lot of your work, you've been recently working on like the Smart Link technology. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that before we turn to some audience questions.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I came away with, not being, the Border Patrol is not foreign to me when I started this book, Reece, but like by the time I got through this into the end, especially the final parts where you talk about both how expansive they've been recently and the kind of intelligence gathering they're doing, I became really concerned because I've spent the last probably year or so really kind of obsessed with this question of what is immigration enforcement, wasn't immigration enforcement allowing law enforcement to do, and people are sort of turning a blind eye to it, that represents a significant threat both to immigrants and all of us. And one of those things is actually in the area of data. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is a different, a partner agency, a sibling agency to Customs and Border Protection, is now tracking almost 250,000, nearly 300,000 people using a smartphone app that tracks their location, that uses facial recognition technology, and that represents massive data sharing. And I think that there are just massive concerns around having, Border Patrol operating in Minneapolis and Portland at the same time the ICE is tracking hundreds of thousands of people. And also, as we found out recently, getting access to LexisNexis data warehouses that track yours and my water bill, our phone bill, everything. They're able to go into these massive, data archives and look for data to try to, drum up cases on people. And I think it represents two sort of twin spears of a threat of really massive surveillance that affects all of us. And I think it's such an important overlap, I think, for anyone here listening to check out the book and to really get the stories and the detailed analysis that's in here, but also just to understand that our country is changing. Immigration enforcement agencies are changing. It is not just about immigration enforcement anymore. It's really about general policing. And that's why I think the title of your book, This Nobody is Protected, is such an important sort of message to take away. Nobody is protected. Immigration enforcement is not about immigrants. It really is become about all of us. Go ahead.
Yeah, while you take a look at the Q&A to pick out a question, I'll just talk about the title for a second. So the title is a quote from Thurgood Marshall, who was on the Supreme Court in the 70s when these key Border Patrol cases were outlined. And in the first of those, in 1973, Almeida Sanchez versus United States, he was questioning the government lawyer about the extent of this Border Patrol authority inside this 100-mile zone. And eventually he'd ask, like, could you stop the vehicle of a Supreme Court justice? And the lawyer's, yeah. Could you stop the president of the United States? And the lawyer's like, yeah, we could. And his conclusion was nobody is protected, right? And I think that certainly has been borne out in the decades since.
Yeah, absolutely. And just I just can't. I have to close with this note, and I will turn over the questions here. But one of the things that you do really well in this book, and I think all your books, Reece, is I know you as a colleague and as a scholar, as a geographer, but your books are very readable, and this one keeps that sort of that reputation. It's very readable. There's a lot of information, but there's a lot of stories. It's like, I think it's very accessible to everyone who's interested in this issue. So I encourage you to check it out. We do have a great question about sort of what can be done. So be thinking about that. But I think the first question I want to go to here actually comes from one of our colleagues, Kevin Johnson, who's written on the Brignone-Ponce case, as I'm sure you know, and just asks, how does anyone define what quote unquote Mexican appearance even is? What does that even mean? And really, I think Kevin is asking, should we reconsider these cases? And maybe in your answer, Reece, you might even touch on where you think these cases, the Brignone-Ponce as well as the Martinez-Fuerte case should be, the Alameda-Sanchez case should be in the history of major Supreme Court cases next to Plessy v. Ferguson and things like that.
Yeah. In the 1976 case, the government lawyer actually said during the oral arguments that Border Patrol agents have a sixth sense that allows them to spot undocumented immigrants, right? And so, which it's just outrageous. But his question is, I think, a good one, right? Because it's ridiculous to say that a Border Patrol agent could distinguish between someone from Mexico or someone from who's lived in San Diego their entire lives. And actually, the lawyer. You mentioned how I tell a lot of stories in the book. I really try to emphasize these two lawyers who brought all of these cases in the 1970s. They were federal public defenders based in San Diego, and they were the ones that managed all of these key cases in front of the Supreme Court. But John Cleary, who was handling the case then, he was just outraged, right, with this claim that you could notice the appearance of someone from Mexico based on their haircut, right? And during the oral arguments, he says, I even get my haircut in Tijuana sometimes, so like it's ridiculous, right? But nevertheless, that's what the ruling still says, right? And so, like you suggested, Austin, well, in the Border Patrol's documents, right? So they have documents for guidance for training agents. Over the years, it's changed a little bit how they phrased it, but it changed from Mexican appearance to foreign appearance in the Border Patrol's training documents. So it's kind of expanded beyond just the Mexican to really be understood that it's a racial characterization based on appearance. But I think you're right, Austin. As I suggest in the book, I see these cases, particularly Brignone-Ponce and Martinez-Fuerte in 75 and 76, the two racial profiling cases, to be as outrageous as Plessy versus Ferguson, these cases that really, Dred Scott decision, right, that are really should be tossed to the dustbin of history, right, that are echoes of the racialized past of the country. But the difference is these are still in effect, right? They have not been undone. They are currently the policy of the United States.
Yeah, and to add to that, Reece, and kind of reinforce that point, we just, the institute that I work at, we looked at some of the recent data on people encountered as inadmissible at these ports of entry. And in the past couple of months, there's, for obvious reasons, been a pretty massive arrival of Ukrainian migrants. Well, guess what happens to Ukrainian migrants who are inadmissible? They actually get waved through, and they've been allowed into the country while, we know that many other migrants have not. And it makes me think, oh, so do Ukrainians look foreign? Like what's, how is this playing out? It's a lot of racial undertones there. Another really great question in the chat about kind of a what do we do question. And I think, for some people are going to bring to that question this idea, well, we need Border Patrol of some kind, but but maybe they've gone too far and we should scale back their authority or some of these abuses. I think other people would say, well, do we need a Border Patrol agency at all? So I wonder how you would sort of answer kind of a range of questions about that. Is there anything that, let's say, the current administration can even do to rein in Border Patrol as an agency?
Yeah, there are absolutely a lot of things that, leaving aside the question of whether we need a Border Patrol or not, which I would say maybe we don't, right? But if we were to think about what steps could be taken now to fix some of these problems, right? So a number of these things are things that are in the hands of the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, right? So for example, the 100-mile zone, as I document in the book, that was just an administrative decision in 1947 to set the 100-mile zone as 100 miles from borders and coastlines. That's not in the congressional authorization. It just says reasonable distance, right? So they could very easily, well, nothing happens very easily in the government, but the Department of Homeland Security could reconsider that, right? And start a process to redefine that zone as a smaller area. 58% of the Border Patrol's apprehensions happen within 1 mile of the border, right? So, there really isn't a clear argument for them to be very far from the border itself, right? So, maybe make the 100-mile zone a 5-mile zone, right? And it wouldn't completely get rid of all of these negative practices, but it would change a lot of them for sure. Here's the ways that would have an impact. One, that would mean it wouldn't be possible to do these interior checkpoints, right? So that would get rid of that. That's also something that the Department of Homeland Security could decide tomorrow to not do anymore, right? So it's within their power. But I think one thing that we haven't talked about, which is deaths in the border zone, right? We just had that, horrific situation with the tractor trailer, and over 50 people died in that. Why were they in that tractor trailer so deep inside the United States? Because of the interior checkpoints, right? So the interior checkpoints are what make people walk 60 miles through the desert, and the dramatic increase in deaths in the Tucson sector are because of the checkpoints, right? So if the Border Patrol was just at the borderline, which that's another thing we didn't talk about. The original authorization in the 1920s said that's where they were supposed to be. And there were a lot of efforts in the 20s and 30s to get them back to the borderline, but that failed. And I tell a lot of those stories in the book. But moving the border zone within 5 miles of the border would have dramatic impacts on those things. There'd be far less impact on American citizens' lives, and it would dramatically reduce the number of deaths that we see in the border zone. So that would be the single most important thing to do. There have been efforts to do that too. So Patrick Leahy, about a decade ago, he was stopped at an interior checkpoint in Vermont and was shocked by this existence in Vermont, that the Border Patrol was there. And so since then, he's tried every session to put in place a new law limiting the border zone, I believe, to 25 miles of the border. A number of other Congress people have been on board with that as well. So there are efforts to do these things to rein it in. But I would say shrinking the 100-mile zone would be the most immediate and impactful thing.
Yeah, fascinating. That was a big takeaway for me too from the book, I have to say. So I'm glad you were able to articulate some of those things. So there's some really interesting policy and legal questions in there, but one question really sticks out to me because Reece, it's been on my mind too. This comes from Jim McKeever. Having published these two books back to back, White Borders, which has been gotten a lot of attention, and then this one, which is obviously just coming out today, specifically taking a critical look, at Border Patrol. I'm as curious as Jim is about how publishing these books what your response has been, and how agencies have responded, how people have responded to the books, especially since you're pushing back on these. I think we would both agree are institutions that have been profoundly shaped by racism, legal institutional racism over the last many years, over the last century. And one doesn't do that without some pushback, without some resistance. I'm curious what that response has been like, and if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about the reception of the books, of these two books together.
Yeah, I think generally the reception has been pretty positive, right? I mean, the my White Borders book, which came out last October, it came out just a few weeks after the images of the Border Patrol, like almost whipping Haitian immigrants near the border, right? Which were just such obviously racist actions, right? And kind of the way that people from Haiti were so quickly deported out of the country, it fit with that kind of long history of racialized policing. And then followed up in Europe, the treatment of Ukrainian refugees versus refugees from anywhere else trying to arrive in Europe, I think really illustrated the racism that's inherent to immigration policing. So there's a lot of, I think, positive feedback in that aftermath. I do find, though, with my books like this, that they tend to get two different types of reviews on places, like Amazon. They're either 4 or 5 stars or 1 stars, right? And I definitely am the target of the white nationalists quite frequently. They're not big fans of what I'm doing and what I'm saying. And so, I take that as kind of a badge of honor, though.
Yeah, well, keep writing for us, Reece, because I don't think we've exhausted the number of issues in this field that you're writing on right now, which is really exciting and important. I think very informative. Maybe just one more question, and this does take us back to the border, I think, but it's worth sort of touching on. There is a lot sort of up in the air right now with very specific border policies, migrant protection protocols, which forces asylum seekers to remain in Mexico. There's Title 42, which was a policy during the Trump administration, ostensibly about public health, that kept all migrants out of, no one could get across the border, although it was not actually about public health, it was about politics. And I'm just kind of curious, what's your read on what's happening with the border right now? How should we think about some of these policies and what's happening right now? I may as well mention as well, we're coming up on the midterms. There are politicians across the country, nowhere near the border, running on a quote unquote closed border. They're making trips to the border. So what's happening with the border right now, and how should we think critically about some of these policies and practices?
Yeah. I mean, the border has become, for the Republican Party, the primary issue. Trump showed them that that anti-immigrant talk certainly motivates the base of their party and is really effective at getting people riled up. But it's not based on any sort of reality, right? I mean, we're talking about, a few 100,000 people arriving at the border. The majority of these people are, 1 million people last year, maybe, but over a longer period of time, it's not been that many in the last few years. And these are people, the big change that's happened at the border is, if you were to go back 15 or 20 years ago, the majority of people who are arriving at the border clandestinely were trying to sneak across the border, right? And were trying to work in the US without documentation, which even that I would say should be allowed, right? The US needs workers. There's a hiring problem in the US, right? And so that has a large part to do with the fact that the last administration limited the number of immigrant visas that were coming into the country, which produces the worker shortage. So even that sort of immigration should be allowed. But what's certainly changed even in the last 5 years is not the majority, but a lot of people arriving at the border today are people looking for asylum, right? So they're not even trying to avoid border agents, right? They're crossing the border and then turning themselves in to the first people that they can find, right? So it's even more ridiculous to demonize that, to call it an invasion, like I think some parts of Texas have been doing today, I believe. It's outrageous, right? It's not an accurate depiction of what's happening at the border, right? So instead, what we should be doing is not accepting these, I would say, extremist right-wing views about the movement of people. Instead, we should be looking at the movement of people as something that's normal. It's something that's happened forever, right? I mean, humans are a migratory species, right? We've moved everywhere over long periods of time. The thing that's new and radical is the idea that we should restrict that, and that there should be these things like borders that prevent the movement of other people. You mentioned the idea that the border is not closed now, and that somehow it could be closed, right? I mean, that's an impossible thing to imagine, right? I mean, because the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, is vast, right? It's almost 2,000 miles long, and it's impossible to completely secure that space, right? So people arguing that they can achieve that through some sort of measure of border security is just wrong, right? It's not going to happen. What we see over and over again through the construction of walls is that it doesn't stop people from migrating. It just sends them to a different place, often a more dangerous place to cross the border. And that pattern will continue into the future. Looking forward to the next 30 to 50 years, climate change is going to displace a lot of people around the world, right? And so we're looking at a situation where migration is going to be increasing. There are going to be a lot more people on the move. And I would suggest that instead of spending so much money on violence, on restrictions, on efforts to prevent people from moving, instead, we should be thinking about mechanisms to facilitate that, to make it safe, to incorporate people when they arrive, rather than spending billions on walls and violence. We should be spending that money on welcome and incorporation.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up, Reece, and a really important message. I think, again, one of the things I think that I certainly take away from it, I think people will take away from it when they read it, is a sense that there is actually a lot that we can do. There is a different future. We can imagine a different outcome from the one that we are currently trending towards. So I hope people will get this and check it out. It's really great. Also, last plug for geography. Reece and I are both geographers. So if you're interested in getting to know a little bit about geography tonight as well. So thanks everyone for coming. And Brad, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great moderating, Austin and Reece. A lot of eye-opening, thought-provoking information in your book. Looking at the Border Control's growth and the significant expansion of its powers, you make a compelling case for rethinking some of its authority. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Nobody is Protected. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.